History was indeed made by the British people on the 23rd of June, which is already being called Independence Day here in the UK. And you might like to know, Alex, that the film Independence Day Resurgence was very carefully timed so that it premiered in the UK on the 23rd of June, and I've already seen it. So there is a great movement afoot now of ordinary people. The moment they get the chance to have their say, and governments in Britain have been trying for decades to deny them the chance to have their say, and in the end it was Nigel Farage, to whom you've quite correctly paid tribute. It was he who for decades has been at the front line battling this. He who transformed UKIP into a useful fighting machine. He who terrified David Cameron so much before the last election that Cameron promised us a referendum in the hope of getting just enough votes to win, which he got, but then he had to hold the referendum he promised, and he couldn't win that because the British people have spoken, and they've spoken decisively enough, 52% to 48%. And as our former Prime Minister William Pitt said, and he said this just after we'd won the Napoleonic War, a previous victory against an overmighty totalitarian.
I almost mentioned Pitt when I was talking about British-style George Washingtons. Go ahead.
Well, let's give the quote that he gave in his speech to the Mansion House dinner just before his death. It was the last speech he made. It was his shortest and his most eloquent. All he said was, "England has saved herself by her exertions and will, as I trust, save Europe by her example." And I think we are now seen very widely throughout Europe as being the voice of reason and sense and liberty against this increasingly cloying and increasingly aggressive totalitarian EU. And of course, the left, which are totalitarian by instinct and by their belief, they welcome the idea that the likes of you and me, Alex, should be locked up for pointing out that the world is not getting warmer at anything like the rate that the left had predicted, that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, effectively a communist organization, they'd predicted a rate of warming that simply hasn't come to pass. It's not happening. So now here we have a proposal again from the left in the EU, this time to bring forward the proposal for a so-called EU army, by which they make all the armies of the member states into one army, commanded, of course, by the unelected commissars, not answerable to any elected parliament.
So people start saying you're taking over, you're arresting people, you're not letting them have speech, you're tax exempt. Their answer is, we're going to take your army over. I mean, that's true occupation, is it not?
Well, it is indeed. And what we have got here is now a gallop towards formal dictatorship. And the question is whether there are still enough independent-minded media around to speak out. You won't hear a word of criticism of this on the BBC, for instance. And this is a big problem. The media are being captured by these people.
It's let me ask you this, because you've worked in media, you've been a top newspaper editor, top advisor to Margaret Thatcher. Just briefly, and then get back to the, I mean, this is really a dictatorship openly announcing itself. Not since Hitler invaded, in my view, have we seen a threat this serious, not even the Soviet Union, because people knew that's an outside group. It didn't have much of a chance. But specifically, the arrogance, the boldness of the left, the radical Islamicists, these imams that call for violence, supporting the EU. I mean, it's really just a crew of motley trash.
Well, what has happened is that the governing class worldwide, the classe politique, as the French call it, they have been making common totalitarian cause. You've got the two kinds of totalitarianism, the corporatists who like to be involved with big business and get big business to go along with them. Those are the fascists. Then you've got the communists, the open collectivists, and that they're now finding common cause for the first time. They battled each other in the 20th century, but now they are standing together against liberty. And that's the significance of this European army move. It's that they're so desperate. They know that the peoples of Europe do not love them. They know that they have failed to deliver what we would regard as useful European government. So they are now panicking and saying, how can we cling by the fingernails to this empire of bureaucracy that we have created, even though it's hated by the peoples of Europe? And the answer, of course, is to get the governing elites of Europe to join together, just as they did in trying to bully us into voting for staying in the European Union, and that failed. So now they're going to do it by force. Just as in the United States, as you rightly point out, there's a growing movement, and it's now almost official part of the Democratic platform, that anybody who actually comes out and says, hang on a moment, there are serious scientific problems with this climate change nonsense, can be arrested and detained and put on trial for that. But here's the difficulty. For as long as they're still talking about putting people on trial, there is at least the chance that you might get a fair trial, because the great thing about a trial is that both sides are heard. The danger with the European army proposal is that there is no court to whom anyone in Europe can appeal if their governing class decides to go down this route, because then that common European army will be established. And let us be quite clear, its aim is not to do what NATO does, to protect the member states of NATO, so that if any one of those states is invaded,
its aim is to keep countries within the system. They admit.
And come to its aid. This is an internal army designed to suppress the will of the people and keep them cowering in fear, and to kick down the door, just like the KGB, if the people disagree with them. That is what the European army is about. That's why they want a European army as well as NATO, because NATO already deals with the external defense of Europe. It's NATO that's kept the peace and kept the Russians and everybody else at bay. So why do they need a European army as well as NATO? Answer, because NATO is explicitly forbidden to police the internal affairs of member states.